Hey guys, Pete the Wargamer here, and as you've probably already guessed from the title of this video, I'm going to be showing you how to kitbash, base, and paint a Wolf Scout. For this, I'll be using one of the new Neophyte models found in the Black Templar army set, which was sent to me by Games Workshop. I'll be giving this guide 2 dead animal bits out of 5. It features a little sculpting and cutting, as well as a few components from other kits. Like Black Templars, Space Wolves employ their Wolf Scouts in a slightly different way than the Guilliman's Codex dictates. Rather than chapters initiates starting in this role, their ranks are instead filled with the more veteran Grey Hunters who prefer a more solitary existence away from the main pack. I began to build one of these scouts by first removing all the parts required to build a Neophyte, with the exception of the head and its haircut. These were all then cleaned up of any mold lines and sprue tabs. The first point of modification were the legs, specifically the tabard. This is very much a Black Templar flair, and so is something I needed to remove from my Space Wolf. The tabard piece does, however, feature the belt, which I would need to retain. So I began by first clipping away the tabard, getting as close to the edge of the belt as possible. Following this, I then removed any remaining bits of tabard and cleaned up the cut using my knife. With the cuts made, I glued together the 2 legs and attached the belt to the front. However, because I had removed the tabard, I now had an empty looking space just below the belt. This would be fixed by adding the section of groinal armor that regular Space Marine Scouts feature. To create this, I began by cutting and mixing up a small amount of green stuff. This was rolled out into a small ball before being placed directly beneath the belt buckle. From here, I used my sculpting tools to flatten it out and achieve the desired armoured codpiece shape. Remember to use plenty of water or Vaseline here. It'll just help to prevent your fingers and tools from sticking to the putty, as well as giving you a smoother finish. This was then left to cure for a couple of hours before I moved on to the next step. After removing the tabard from the legs, the next issue I had was a small section of fabric that sat over the Scout's stomach. This wouldn't need to have any armor sculpting onto it and would just need to have the fabric shaved back a little. I cut and trimmed back the bulk of the fabric until it was more in line with the torso. I checked the fit of this a few times to ensure that everything was still lining up properly against the legs. But before I finished assembling the torso, I first removed the aquila from the chest. This is something you've probably seen me do before, but for those of you that haven't, I began by cutting away some larger chunks with a knife to remove the bulk of the symbol. This was then cleaned up by scraping the edge of the blade in order to smooth it out and to create more space for extra equipment and details during painting. With this done, the 2 halves of the torso were glued together and then attached to the legs. The Black Templar Neophyte models come equipped with chainswords, so in order to recreate that more classic Wolf Scout look, I decided to replace it with one of the Reaver blades. This process was started by first using my knife to make a clean cut just above the Neophyte's hand, removing the chainsword from it. I then cleaned up the cut and proceeded to make the same to the Reaver arm, again cutting away just above the fingers to retain the guard before cleaning up the cut. With both the Reaver blade and the Neophyte arm prepped, the blade could be glued to the hand. This was followed up by gluing the blade carrying arm and the unmodified right arm to the torso. With the arms in place, the shoulder pads could then be attached. Unfortunately, they come with pre-sculpted Maltese crosses, which meant that they needed to be removed. This was approached in an identical manner to the chest aquila. I started out by removing larger chunks before smoothing them out into a featureless surface. This was done to both shoulder pads before gluing them to the arms. Now that the bulk of the model was complete, I could look at adding some extra equipment. I first took this component from the Reaver sprue, but after a quick comparison, found that it was a little too large to fit against the Scout's waist. So I decided to cut away the sheath and, after a little trimming, glued this to the Scout's waist. At this stage in the build, I felt that the model was a little top heavy and needed bulking out a little around the legs. So another pouch set was used, this time being taken from the Intercessor's kit. In a similar method to before, I separated out the smallest of the pouches from the other 2 and filed it back to make its profile much shallower. This pouch, after a little adjustment, was then glued to the right thigh of the Scout to create a pocket. This was followed by 2 remaining pouches which were then glued to the back of the model. The equipment was then finished off with one of the chest grenade mounts from the Reaver kit, making most of the empty space I'd created on the armor. With the equipment complete, the Scout now needed a head. As the Wolf Scouts are drawn from the more experienced ranks of the Space Wolves, I chose a head from the Firstborn Space Wolves kit that looked a little more wise and experienced. Unfortunately, the beard was preventing me from attaching the head in the position that I wanted, so a few progressive trims were made to the right side of the beard, making frequent comparisons throughout. Once I was happy with the fit, I glued the head into place. The final step was to add a little more Space Wolf flair. There are lots of small trinkets and details that can be added to your model to represent this, but I chose the necklace from the Thunderwolf Cavalry box. I decided to attach this to the waist, and once it was fixed into place, the conversion was done, which meant that I could move onto the base. If you're familiar with my channel, then you will already know how much I love to use torn-up cork floor tiles on my bases. They're cheap, super easy to use, and make for great rocky outcrops. I tore up a small section of rock and attached this to the center of the base. I then tore up a few small chunks and dotted these around to the large piece to add a little height variation. As I can't go an entire video without pinning at least one thing, I use this technique to get a stronger bond between the model and the base. I drilled into the Scout's right foot first and superglued it into my 1mm wire. This was then cut to length and compared against the cork. I drilled another hole through the cork and into the base and superglued the wire into place. The final step was then to use some Vallejo texture paste to fill in some of the gaps around the rocks. This was left to fully dry before I moved on to the painting stage. I began with the ever important primer step. This first layer was applied through my airbrush, and I made use of Pro Acryl's black-brown primer mixed with a little flow improver to help it through the airbrush. Primers give your miniatures a better surface to paint onto and can also play an important step in the shading of your model. I chose a dark colour here, as it meant that any deep recesses that I might miss later on would simply appear as dark shadows. The next step was an optional one. I mixed some of Tamiya's XF2 flat white with a little airbrush thinner and lightly sprayed it from above the model. This caused the paint to only accumulate on the surfaces where light would fall naturally. By doing this, I created a sort of template that I could follow when I began to apply and build up my layers, allowing me to better judge where to place those brighter paints to achieve a more natural result. With the model sufficiently prepped, I could begin the actual painting. I approached each of these steps using pretty much identical techniques, so I'll go into a little bit more detail with the first iteration of steps and keep things simpler later on. So I began with my first base coat of dark neutral grey. This was added to my wet palette and thinned out with just a little water. Doing this will not only make the paint easier to apply, but it will also create a smoother finish. This paint was then applied over the cloth areas. By using a thin mixture here, the paint was applied with a slight transparency, allowing the lighter spots of white to be just about visible through the paint once it had dried. To add some definition and spots of the light to the fabric, I then created a lighter version of dark neutral grey by adding in some pale yellow. I use this faded yellow colour rather than white, as it prevents the colour from looking too washed out and adds a bit of warmth into the tone. This paint was thinned like before, but this time I only applied it to the more raised points of the model, leaving the darker base colour only visible in the recesses. This was followed up by adding in a little more pale yellow to my mixture to lighten it further. This paint was then applied on an even smaller area than before, being focused mainly around the points where the Zenital light layer had fallen on earlier. Once again, more pale yellow was added, creating a very light grey. I focused this to only the most prominent points, using it to pick out creases and edges in the cloth. The finished effect is that of a gradual transition from a dark grey through to a light grey on the areas you would expect to be the brightest. This process was then repeated over the armour. I first began with my base coat of a thinned blue-black. This dark bluish grey tone would create the perfect starting point for my Space Wolves blue armour scheme. I then followed this up with some blue-black and pale yellow mixtures. Like before, I started out with the darker tones and steadily added more yellow to build up to the light points, focusing these brighter paints to the top edges and panels of the armour. After the gradients in the armour were completed, I then created a glaze of sky blue. I did this by adding water to a very small amount of the paint, resulting in an extremely translucent mixture. This was then applied across all of the armor, which very subtly adjusted the tone. The glaze was not only helped to bring out the blue in the armor, but it also helped to smooth out the gradients, making those steps between the progressively lighter tones less noticeable. My attention was then turned to the areas of the leather on the model. This included the boots and equipment pouches. All of these areas were first base coated with the reddish brown of mahogany, before being steadily layered up and highlighted with progressively lighter mixtures of the mahogany and pale yellow. This resulted in some nice warm tones on the model, which contrasted nicely against the cooler blues and greys of the armor and fabric. The skin was the next area to paint and was tackled slightly differently. I began with my base coat as per usual, thinning out the mixture before applying it in an even manner across the arms and the face. However, instead of adding pale yellow to my mix, I instead added pale pink. This helped to retain a more realistic skin tone. Mixing in pure yellow would have instead resulted in a more pallid and sickly tone, which is something I didn't want here. This mixture was used as a layer, keeping the darker shadow flesh only visible in the recesses. Pale pink on its own was then used to very carefully pick out only the most prominent features such as the nose, cheeks and brow with a fine edge highlight. By this point I had a good solid start to my skin tone, but I wanted to add just a little bit more detail. To help sell that this model is operating in a colder environment, I created a thin glaze of transparent red, much like I had done earlier with the sky blue. I then applied this in a series of subtle layers across the bridge of the nose and onto the cheeks to create a slight ruddy glow. As I've mentioned earlier, I wanted this model to look a little aged and grizzled, and so adding some greying hair would be a good way to represent this. I began with a mixture of mahogany and dark neutral grey to create a slightly washed out dark brown colour. A little water was mixed in, and this was used to base coat the top knot and the beard of my Wolf Scout. Then, using a pale yellow once again, I set about lightening my original mixture in order to create a series of highlights. These were focused on the individual strands of hair and helped to create a greying hair colour that still had a hint of its original brown tone. A glaze of blue-black was then created and applied around the top, back and sides of the head. Once dried, this created the effect of stubble on a shaved head. It's small details like these that really go a long way to building up character in your models. The weapon stock, grenades and pipes were all very simple. I started out with coal black, before building up a couple of highlights with a coal black and pale yellow mixture, paying extra care to get those fine edge highlights across those crisp details. Then all that was left to do was to paint the metals. For the steel parts of the model, I first base coated with some dark silver, before highlighting the edges of some of the brighter metallic paint silver. The weapon guard and edging on the sheath were then base coated with bronze. And finally, their edges were picked out with some rich gold. After this step, I made sure to change out my paint water to prevent any metal flakes from making their way into my other paints. By this stage, the model was complete. Well, mostly. There were still a couple of extra details that I could add. The first of these were some decals. I've covered this process in more detail in other videos, and I'll link to one of those above, but the basic process is as follows. First, you want to apply some gloss varnish to the target area. I'm using Army Painter gloss varnish for this. The gloss will create a really smooth surface in which to apply the decal to, and will help prevent that ghosting effect. While this dries, you can go ahead and cut out your chosen markings from their sheet and soak them in water for about 30 seconds to a minute, until they're coming away from their backing paper. Then, using a damp brush, you can carefully coax the transfer from the paper and onto your target area. You can also use this brush to adjust the position as necessary. Once you're happy with the placement, give the water a chance to dry. To help the decal conform to the surface and to help create that painted on effect, you're going to want to grab yourself some microsol. This mild solvent can be carefully dabbed onto the transfer in small amounts until it is sitting a little closer to the surface. Finally, another coat of varnish, matte or gloss, will help to seal the decal in place and allow you to add some paint on details over the top if you wish. Another extra detail you can add is some chipping. To do this, I created a mixture of pale yellow and blue-black once again, but this time I went at least as light as I had done for the final highlight of the armor. Then I dipped a small piece of foam into the mixture and gently dabbed away some of the excess paint onto some tissue. With the very rough edge of the foam, I gently stippled the paint onto a few of the hard edges of the armor and across a few of the flat surfaces. This left behind small irregular shapes of brighter paint that appeared as scratches and dents. These can be further added by using a fine-tipped brush as well. To make a few of these scratches and dents appear a little deeper, I then applied a very fine line of mahogany next to a few of them, making sure that the lines sat parallel to each other and that the mahogany always sat above the pale blue. This resulted in the illusion of depth in the surface and helped to sell the idea that these scratches are having a slight three-dimensional appearance to them. With the Space Wolf painted, I could now shift my focus to the base. To quickly paint the highly textured rocks, I chose to use some dry brushing and started by creating a mixture of black and olive flesh. I chose olive flesh over my regular pale yellow here in order to create a more desaturated tone. I then dipped my brush into the paint, removed some of the excess onto a piece of paper and quickly dragged my brush over the rocks. This caused the paint to only form on the very edges, helping to bring emphasis to those details. I repeated this process a couple of times, with each iteration adding more olive flesh into the mix and with a lighter touch each time. The last step was to add the snow. I like to create my snow by mixing together a few materials. I use crushed glass as my aggregate, some gloss varnish to help bond the pieces and add some shininess, and finally a little white paint to create that fluffy snow colour. I mix these together to form a thick paste that is then spread across a few areas of the base. Once every area is covered, but while the paste is still wet, I then dip my whole base into the crushed glass. This creates that semi-translucent glistening effect over the top of the paste, completing the snow effect. I should note that I would recommend wearing at least a dust mask when working with crushed glass, and avoid touching your eyes until you've washed your hands. And with that, the base and the model was completed. And all that's left to do is to varnish the model in whatever way you prefer, and you should be left with something a bit like this. And here we have the completed Wolf Scout. It's been a while since I've done a single focus Space Marine conversion like this, and it was nice to be able to focus all my effort into one miniature. As a result, I've been able to spend a bit more time converting, building and basing and sharing that whole process with you. The only downside to this particular kitbash is its base model, particularly because these updated Scout models are only available in the Black Templar Primaris Crusader sets. But I've tried to ensure that there is enough information here that you can find some use for these tips and ideas when you're tackling other models as well. I'd love to hear what you thought about this guide, and if you have any ideas for other conversions you'd like to see me tackle in future videos, then let me know in the comments below. I'll include all the paints used in this guide in the description along with some affiliate links, so if you're looking to try out some of these things for yourself while supporting me in the process, I would be extremely grateful. Speaking of which, let me just say a huge thank you to my ever-generous supporters. Currently, my top supporters on Patreon are Jonathan Hart, Berserker, Daniel Dowling, Dakota the Destroyer, Jake, Jeremy Kaup, Jesse Smith, Casper Lindberg, Lyconian Primarch, Merrick, Mr. Grimm, Swedsman, and Tim. So a big thank you to you guys, and if you also support me on Patreon, buy me a coffee or you just use my affiliates links, then it's the kind-hearted people such as yourselves that allow me to fund the kit and tools required to build these conversions for you. And so until next time, thanks for watching and goodbye.